It's been a topic of some debate going back to the earliest days of the identification of progressive rock as a music genre as to whether the Beatles were in fact a participant in the prog rock genre itself. Those who claim that the Beatles were not prog rock tend to do so based on the music. Certainly, the Beatles were not influenced by neoclassical composers. They weren't influenced by Perez or Stravinsky the way Frank Zappa was. They weren't influenced by Bela Bartok in the way that Keith Emerson or Robert Fripp were. And they certainly weren't influenced by jazz music, unless you count some of the parody songs that they did as part of their repertoire. You Know My Name, Look Up the Number in particular comes to mind there, with the saxophone work that Brian Jones did in a sessions role. I would argue that the Beatles were very important to progressive rock, not necessarily in terms of the music, but in terms of innovation. The Beatles were very interested in adding new instruments to the mix in their recorded work. Certainly, George Harrison's experiments with Indian music were part of that, and the Beatles were early adopters of first the mellotron and later the Moog synthesizer as well. But perhaps even more importantly, the Beatles had tremendous support in the recording studio from their producer, Sir George Martin, as well as Martin's staff at Abbey Road Studios and later as part of his company Air. Besides George Martin, some of the great behind-the-scenes personnel that the Beatles worked with included Chris Thomas, Ken Scott, Pete Henderson, Jeff Emmerich, and Alan Parsons, all of whom became terrific music producers in their own right. The Beatles began experimenting with studio technology going back to 1965 during the sessions that produced their album Rubber Soul. But they really began to get serious about it in 1966 with the making of their album Revolver. There are some really notable songs on this album that featured innovation of various kinds. On I'm Only Sleeping, for example, the use of what became known as varispeeding, or VSO for varispeed oscillation, came to the fore in a very big way. VSO refers to the changing of the playback speed of a recording in order to change its pitch. In the case of I'm Only Sleeping, John Lennon's vocals were treated with a significant amount of varispeeding to slow them down and to give them something of a dreamlike quality. But it didn't stop there, of course. George Harrison's guitar solo on I'm Only Sleeping is a masterfully done solo that makes great use of technology, in particular the use of backwards playback. The Beatles recording historian Mark Lewison points out in his writings on this that when it comes to doing backwards recording, there are two different ways to do it. One is the easy way, which is to record a piece and then flip the tape over and play it backwards. The Beatles had already experimented with this particular approach on their single that preceded the Revolver album, Rain, the B-side of Paperback Writer. In the case of I'm Only Sleeping, they went the full Monty, so to speak. George Harrison recognized that he wanted to have a backwards effect on his solo, figured out what he wanted the solo to contain in terms of the notes he would play, the lengths at which he would play them, and then mapped them out backwards and played them backwards, so that when the tape was reversed, he got the solo he wanted, but with the backwards treatment applied during the playback cycle. It worked to perfection. Another song on Revolver that made an interesting contribution to the prog canon is Yellow Submarine. Yes, Yellow Submarine. I say that because of the song's innovative use of tape loops. Paul McCartney, of course, wrote the song for Ringo Starr to sing and kept the structure of the song very simple given that. But he embellished the song to dramatic effect through the use of tape loops and with treatment to his voice through a ring modulator. These were techniques that Paul McCartney would use in some of the Beatles' later work, as well as with certain recordings of his own. Listen in particular to the second section of Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey. Finally, of course, there's the prog rock masterpiece, Tomorrow Never Knows. On Tomorrow Never Knows, the Beatles make great use of tape loop technology and flanging, as well as the innovative technique of John Lennon singing his vocal through a Leslie speaker to treat his voice with the Doppler effects that would ordinarily be done using a Leslie to the output of a Hammond organ. Very interesting stuff in the sense that it was making use of the technology in ways the technology wasn't designed to be used. The Beatles, of course, would continue to do that going forward. In the sessions that produced the album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the Beatles would make use of the technology to great effect on several songs. For me, the most notable examples of this are on the single that preceded the album, Strawberry Fields Forever, where the Beatles made their first notable use of a mellotron, an instrument that they had been introduced to by Mike Pinder of the Moody Blues. And it's of particular note that Strawberry Fields was created using two disparate takes of the song that were in different keys. John Lennon gave George Martin the unenviable task of matching these two takes together in a way that a continuous performance could be achieved. George Martin and his staff did this through the use of varispeeding and did a remarkable job of creating a great effect for the song. The other great song that has very strong prog tendencies from Sgt. Pepper's is A Day in the Life. A Day in the Life, of course, is effectively two different songs, one written primarily by John Lennon and the other by Paul McCartney, which was utilized for the song's bridge. The real progressive work here, though, came in the sonic qualities of the song created by George Martin, in particular the song's use of the orchestra as a means of creating the special effect of a falling sensation when the song transitions first to the bridge and ultimately to the outro prior to the song's famous extended closing chord was almost miraculous in the effect that it created. I remember upon hearing this album for the first time in 1967, my older sister purchased a mono copy of the album, brought it into our listening room with the lights down, and told me before the song played, just picture that you're on an elevator in the Empire State Building and that it's malfunctioned and that you're falling from the top of the building to the bottom. The effect that George Martin's strings created here were quite amazing for their time. Also of interest, although these didn't feature on the monophonic version of the album that I grew up with, were the work that the Beatles did on the inner groove of the album to make use of that space for recorded content, including a 15 kilohertz tone that John Lennon insisted be added to annoy dogs, and that most humans would not be able to hear. The inner groove recording technique would, of course, be used by many progressive rock artists going forward, including the Moody Blues, David Bowie, King Crimson, and Peter Gabriel. On the Beatles' White Album, the band would continue to make use of the mellotron in particular. The mellotron featured in a large way on John Lennon's track Bungalow Bill, with Chris Thomas playing the instrument. But as far as prog rock content was concerned, the song that really stands out from the White Album is John Lennon's Happiness is a Warm Gun. This song was primarily recorded while George Martin was out of the studio on holiday. Chris Thomas, although uncredited, was in charge of these sessions where the Beatles played live in the studio using various combinations of odd time signatures and making the song very memorable as a result. Finally, on the Beatles album Abbey Road, the Moog synthesizer was introduced in a very large way. The Moog appears on multiple songs, both for use in special effects and as a means of carrying melody forward. The Beatles were not the first rock band to make use of the Moog. It had been used to great effect, of course, by Wendy Carlos on the Switched on Bach album, and in the rock context had been used by numerous artists, including The Doors, The Monkees, and The Byrds. The Beatles really, however, put it to use as a melodic instrument as well as a means for special effects. As a special effects tool, the Moog was used to great effect on John Lennon's tune, I Want You, She's So Heavy. The white noise that Lennon produced in the coda of that song was apparently very difficult to reproduce when the album would be remastered in the late 1980s for compact disc format. Paul McCartney would make use of the instrument on a couple of his selections, including Maxwell's Silver Hammer and Carry That Weight. But the most prog application of the instrument would be done by George Harrison, who had been an early adopter of the Moog, buying one several years before. Harrison had gotten a significant amount of coaching on how to play the instrument, first from the Moog representative Bernie Krause, who assisted Harrison with his album Electronic Sound. Some have claimed, in fact, that Harrison stole a fair amount of Krause's work in compiling that album. Harrison would also receive tutoring on the instrument from Mike Vickers of the band Manfred Mann, who was one of Moog's representatives in the UK, and who would, of course, later introduce Keith Emerson to use of the Moog synthesizer. Harrison applied the Moog to brilliant effect on his signature song, Here Comes the Sun. Here Comes the Sun probably could be considered a prog song without the use of the Moog, considering the interesting use of varied time signatures. Harrison's playing individual measures of 11 and 15 in different phrases of the song, time signatures that he became accustomed to playing in his explorations of Indian music a couple of years prior. But the solos on the Moog that were then applied in various sections of the song to convey the song's meaning were exquisitely done. This is one of the best early applications of the Moog in rock music that I can think of. And yes, the Beatles did it. So all of that to say, the Beatles might not have been a hardcore progressive rock band, but it's hard to find another band whose innovations affected the directions of progressive rock in such a dramatic way. The fact that the Beatles had given up touring by 1966 and were able to devote their full time to exploring how to make their music memorable in the studio is something that the rock music community in general, and prog rock in particular, benefited tremendously from. Very curious to hear your opinions on this. By all means, please leave your comments. If you enjoyed this episode, of course, please click like. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, what are you waiting for? Join us as a subscriber of Progpaganda now and enjoy each and every episode going forward. Thanks very much, as always. You take good care. Bye-bye.